Welcome everyone to our webinar today, looking at what we hope will be an interesting topic, opportunities through tech, with potential interest for a range of different charities. My name is Rustomji and I head the charities practice at Browne Jacobson with a particular emphasis on governance and constitutional issues. I'm also a trustee of 2 charities. Before we get started, let me introduce our panel. We have regular panelists Charles Mesquita of Quilter Cheviot and James Saunders of Kingston Smith. We also have guest panelists today, Rhodri Davies of Charities Aid Foundation, who each have different experiences and examples to share around this theme. We were focusing on how can IT be made more accessible to the sector and what difference could that make? Personally, I would query whether IT spend by charities always presents good value for money, or are charities sometimes lacking in their knowledge and expertise, meaning that poor procurement decisions are made, perhaps buying a system that isn't compatible with the other systems a charity is using, so they're not getting maximum benefit from that. So Charles, if I start with you, as a trustee but also as an advisor to charities, do you have a view whether charities do spend their money wisely when it comes to IT and tech? Or is there potentially a lack of money or skills, too little or too much confidence that might be having an impact on that?
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is a cost of doing business. And I don't think, I mean, charities aren't alone. This affects anybody running an organization. And we're all faced with the same dilemma. I mean, you know, innovation and technology is changing at such a pace, it's just difficult to keep up with it. And, you know, because of the speed of change and the fear, I suppose, of systems becoming redundant, is when you put something in, is it then still fit for purpose, or are there better systems out there? And sort of against that, you've got a lot of people who just go, well, technology is the solution for everything and it'll solve all your problems, etc., which it doesn't. And in fact, there was a lovely guy called Ollie Leggett who gave a wonderful quote the other day where he said, you know, telephones don't teach you how to communicate. All they do is enable you to be able to speak to people in over vast distances. And I think you just have to sort of take that as a mindset. I mean, where I'm a trustee at RL Glasspool, you know, when I first became a trustee, they just moved from having a paper-based grant application system to an online one. And there was a cost attached to putting the system in, and the purpose of was really so that we were going to be able to gather much greater information and data from it, but also be able to increase productivity. In fact, what happened was completely reverse, and that productivity declined. And part of the problem was that we had effectively taken a paper-based system and just tried to replicate it onto an online system, and also had gone and created our own system rather than buying something off the shelf. And the reason we didn't buy it off the shelf was that there wasn't a system there that was going to be able to do what we needed to do it. But actually, although there was a cost attached to that, you could look at it as a failure. I actually look at it as a route of passage, because we're now gone back and gone, okay, fine, we need to rethink about the way we're doing things. We need to think about what is the system we really want. And so we've used this mistake as an opportunity to learn, and hopefully in the future actually you know, put in a better system where we will increase productivity. We will get much better data so that we can actually be much closer to showing the impact that we're doing. So actually, do I see that cost as a failure? No, not really, so long as we actually learn from it. And I think any organization looking at technology, and obviously the bigger the project, the more expensive it is, the scarier it is. But this is a you know, a journey of discovery, and one just has to accept that whatever you do, there are always going to be chances that it doesn't quite work in the way that it does. And actually, more often than not, what happens is what you anticipate isn't necessarily what transpires. I mean, a wonderful thing, just as talking about it the other day, is I remember when emails were introduced, and the chief executive of the company I was working for at the time was really fearful that people wouldn't get up off their desks and go and talk to other people. But actually, what he didn't anticipate was that the benefits from increased flow of information and how much more efficient we've been able to get and everything else, actually the biggest downside of it is the number of emails you get and how much, and it's sifting through that. So going back to your original question, do charities spend money wisely? I think they spend it as wisely as any other organisation, and this is just a cost of business.
That's interesting, Charles. Thank you. And I think perhaps following on from that, you know, as well as the initial purchase, do you feel that enough time is taken to fully embed the new system that's brought in? So, you know, requiring initial and ongoing training, or perhaps is there too much focus just on that purchase and then not enough on the implementation of it?
Actually, to my mind, if there was one single piece of advice I would give any organisation, anybody, is that that we spend an awful lot of time agonising over what we're buying, and we don't spend enough time analysing the way that the systems are used. And I think a lot more could be done. You know, people get very comfortable in the way that they work. They're reluctant to change. That's an understandable human, you know, part of where we are. And whenever we do training, we expect that we can do it, you know, just in small bits to get everybody working, and then we just assume everybody will do it and use things efficiently. And I think that spending a bit more time actually analysing how people are using systems, whether they are using them more efficiently, and then how you could help them use it more efficiently would be actually a much greater investment for an organisation rather than worrying about putting in massively fancy systems when you're not necessarily utilising the systems you've already got to their best of ability.
Yeah. And James, if I come to you now, so in your work with charities, particularly as a charity auditor, do you find that systems used by charities provide them with the financial information they need and also that you need?
Yes, well, certainly from an auditor's perspective, I think this C19 period has really shown, you know, we call it remote auditing, auditing without necessarily going to the client's premises. And it's shown that the financial information can be readily available for an examination, for an audit. You know, there's a lot of hub sharing, portal sharing of information. So that's you know, that's one side that you know, we can get the information across. Whether the information is easily presentable in the right format in the first place is the next question. And I think I mean, fund accounting is a prime example for charities. Are there enough accounting software pieces that can reasonably deal with fund accounting and reserve accounting for charities? Charities operate, you know, project activities, project-based activities, which obviously need funding and cost maintenance. They also have to account for their funds and their reserves. And invariably what we find is that that reserve accounting for an awful lot of charities is quite a clunky process. It isn't done by the accounting system or as part of the accounting system or the accounting software rather. It's done as a manual process, a rather clunky manual process to export information onto Excel or some other format to get it into a reporting format, either for board purposes or for, in the end, for accounts prep and external audit purposes. So the tech, in that sense, for financial information purposes, is I would say is patchy, and I think a lot of charities benefit from having a system that they have almost crowbarred into one that they want and they can use effectively. And of course, I mentioned reserve accounting because it does have impact, a legal impact. You know, charities have to legally spend money that is restricted in certain ways. It also has an impact for designation of funds, and it also has an impact for budgeting and forecasting as well. So you know where you're going to be next year with restricted and unrestricted reserves and funds. So that, I think, is an example of where I don't think that the tech really helps charities very much on the accounting side. I think there are other elements on the financial side, like financial security and making sure that you know, your financial data, your financial information is safe from cybercrime and fraud. And of course, the finance department of any charity is going to be a target for any hackers or fraudsters who do want to get into your systems. And we've seen an awful lot of that in the last few years, from direct access into systems, to email hackers, to people ringing up and diverting payment information, that sort of thing. It does often depend on that personal element, but the systems in place have got to be robust, and you've got to be aware, and of course you've got to be very, very current on these things as well, to make sure that you're coping with the current threats to your financial system.
Mm. And I'm hoping this is not an unfair question, James, but what do you think about the head of finance also being the head of IT?
Yeah, we see this more and more often, and I'm not quite sure why. It worries me sometimes, because if they're suitably qualified, then then of course the risk is reduced, and there can be some efficiencies. But the departments are very, very different. And I think there is always the question about whether a personal choice comes into decisions on, for example, IT systems and software in particular, accounting software as an example. It's very easy for a new FD or a new CFO or whatever to come in and this isn't restricted to charities by any means, but to come in and say, well, that system's no good. Here's one that I've used previously. It's brilliant. Sweep the old one away, bring the new one in, without necessarily asking whether the old system really wasn't fit for purpose, or whether that person just didn't really understand it very well. It was working very well for pretty much everyone else in the organisation, and it was doing what it should do for the organisation, for the systems. So there is that danger, I think, and this combination of FD and IT, in charge of IT as well. I think it does. Yes, there's potential for conflicts there, I think. Yes.
Mm. And James, in your position as a trustee, what IT systems or approaches have you seen that are either evolutionary or revolutionary?
Well, yes. I mean, I'm a school governor, and we use a portal where, excuse me, where all documentation is stored, which is obviously very useful. I was always very impressed with it. All information was there. All our documents were there. Our agendas, our minutes, all the papers for meetings. Brilliant stuff. I was very impressed, and it was easy to access, and there was an app for it for the iPad. Brilliant. So I was quite impressed with all that, and I thought that was quite a good use of tech. But then I became a trustee of a PPE response charity just a few months ago, and I have to say I had my eyes opened by how they were using tech and how tech savvy they were with what they were using to do their regular work. I mean, everything was around the apps and the software and the tech. They were using Microsoft 365 and the Google Suite and all these vast array of different apps to do all sorts of work. Loads of brilliant stuff, really creative. And I think that's the real key to it. It was really creative stuff. They were publishing weekly newsletters through, I think it was through Sway, which were fantastic. And I understand it's really, really easy to do. I mean, I've got no idea how to do it, but this publishing stuff that was producing beautiful documents. It wasn't just a Word document sent out each week, which is perfectly fine if that's what you do. But in terms of a newsletter, it was glossy. It was all intricate and it was fantastic. And they used Slack for project management, I think, and all sorts of different things. And we had a trustee meeting just last week, and over Zoom, and someone said, who's going to take the minutes this time? So I said, I'll take the minutes this time. And I got out my paper and pen, and I could hear them sniggering at the other end of the Zoom call. What's he doing? Why isn't he just typing it into the Google Drive Word document that we've got going? I'm not familiar with that really. So having been laughed at, I had to think about it. But I was thinking actually perhaps it's the real issue with me, I think, is probably that I was more worried about breaking something or doing something wrong than actually just using the tech. So I do understand Google Drive, and I can get on it, and I understand that you can amend documents, online, and fine. What I didn't want to do was overwrite the last minutes, and that's the uncertainty, I think, as someone who is, slowly growing through their life with tech, rather than the guys that have actually grown up with it there and then, and it's second nature, and they just have a slightly different understanding, that younger generation, of how tech works. So yeah, I felt a bit of a dinosaur, I have to say, on that occasion. But that PP charity for it and the way they work, it's unprecedented to me how quickly they got up and running, how quickly they do these things. And I think it probably really does show, that saying necessity is the mother of invention. It really does show that things can be done quicker if you start from scratch, rather than, try and build on something that's already there.
Mm. And I think that might lead nicely into Rhodri, actually, at this point. We'd be very interested in the policy work you've been involved with concerning charities, IT and future technology. Are there any examples that you could mention at this point that might help demonstrate the sorts of things that charities could get involved with and the benefits that they could have if they did take that leap, I suppose, into that unknown element of tech?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are lots of interesting examples. There's still only a handful in lots of areas when you're thinking about more emerging tech, some of which I can mention in a moment. I think the thing that's really interesting to me is the gap we can still see between the awareness and the appreciation within the sector of the fact that tech is a factor that affects all of the whole of an organization and all organizations, and that you can't anymore sort of isolate it inside the IT function or see it as something that's happening over in the distance. The gap between that and what is actually being done at a strategic level to kind of to put organizations in a position to adapt to the for what they need to do to the future. And we've just done the second version of our charity landscape research that we do with Akibo at CAF, and we ask, one of the questions we ask, or a series of them, is around kind of perception of the importance of tech issues and what they're doing about them. And again, this year, I think it's up in the sort of 85 to 90% of the charity leaders that we spoke to agree that technology is important to them, and they need to do something and have a strategy in place. But when you ask how many of you actually do have a strategy in place, it suddenly drops down to the sort of 30 or 40%. And even when you're thinking about tools that are already very readily available, like online fundraising tools or social media, again, it's the 30 to 40% level of organizations saying that they feel comfortable with it, and the ambition is that much higher. And I think what this shows is that there's still a lot to be done to kind of close the gap between what we can see is coming a few years down the line and what we need to put in place now. And I think some of that speaks very much to the points that James and Charles have raised already. I think one of them is absolutely key to me for organizations is not feeling like they need to know for themselves straight away exactly what technology or what solution they need to be using, particularly when it comes to more emergent tech. What you need to do is start from the problem you're trying to solve, whether that's sort of an internal organizational problem or something that you're trying to deliver on the ground, and then educate yourself or kind of reach out to people who can help you understand what the technology can do to help you address that problem. Because the danger otherwise is you end up with all these sort of very highly technologically driven solutions that are in search of real world problems, or you have a very over-engineered solution that's far too complex and expensive. And I think that kind of waste is not something you can really we can really kind of stand for in the charity sector, because resources are so scarce, now particularly. I think the other thing is certainly that speaks to something James was saying there is increasingly, there are a lot of very low cost or even free tools available out there, often because they're provided on a sort of platform basis or by cloud providers, and things like the Google suite of products and many others. Actually, it's not, they're great for small organizations, and they have a real sort of democratizing effect, because you don't any longer need to sort of even pay for software licenses necessarily. You can use all of these tools. But it's not just that they're cheaper, it's actually that they're better for certain ways of working, to the extent that I've seen big organizations, up to even the scale, I think, of people like Cancer Research UK, use Google quite a lot in their mainstream operations, because they find the fact to kind of work collaboratively on documents helps them with the way that they're structuring teams and kind of working in a more distributed way. So I think, there's a lot that can be done for very low cost. And again, I think when it comes to the more emergent stuff, the feeling that if you're going to even dip a toe with something like artificial intelligence, you have to you get on board a team of machine learning experts and plow huge amounts of money into it is not actually right. There are you have to find them, but there are lower cost ways of getting involved by finding things like off the shelf ways of using and building chatbots. I myself, I'm not a huge tech person, but I managed to educate myself to the level of building a very rudimentary machine learning system, or training it to do admittedly something quite silly, but it was actually doable with a laptop and a bit of bloody mindedness in half a day. And then I think the other thing that goes to something Charles was saying there, which is really crucial for charities to get their heads around, is that it's a lot of this stuff, particularly as you're looking ahead to more emergent technology. It's not just about picking the technology and buying it in, because I think that's just trying to sometimes fit a square peg into a round hole. Actually, it tends to end up being much more about kind of more fundamental questions of governance and working patterns and kind of human resources, how you're structuring teams and that sort of thing. And I think actually, if you want to get the benefits of a lot of these technologies, you have to have a more sort of fundamental think about the ways in which you're employing people, whether you're embracing remote and agile working and those kinds of things. And that means that the drive has to come from the very top. So it has to be the senior leadership team and the trustees taking that decision in a holistic way, not just somebody who's in charge of IT spend making those decisions on behalf of the organization, I think, if we're genuinely going to have a shift towards what the future might bring.
That's great, thank you. And Rhodri, when we talk about digital transformation, what would you say are the challenges and the opportunities for charities coming from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big challenges for charities are, always the same ones, in that it's lack of knowledge often, lack of skills, I think risk appetite, or kind of, and sometimes that's perceived risk of embracing the technology because they're seen as more high risk than they actually are in reality, because I think the perception is that you have to kind of decide, as I was saying up front, and then make a very big spend, whereas actually I think I'm more interested in a sort of iterative process of experimenting and then seeing what works and what doesn't, and doing that in a low cost way. I think what's been really interesting during the pandemic, and I think again this is something James touched on, is the extent to which necessity has become the mother of invention for a lot of organizations, because we've all had to make a very sharp pivot to digital ways of working if we weren't already doing it. So we're doing this meeting on Zoom, as are many other people, and webinars and things, when we otherwise probably almost certainly would have been doing it in person. And in many ways that would have been nice. But lots of organizations are finding that the received wisdom they had internally about things that couldn't possibly be done digitally, well, they've just had to make it work, and they have made it work. And we're all going through an interesting process at the moment, I think, of seeing which elements of what we're making work now we might want to hang on to when we come out the other side of this pandemic, and which elements we've realized wing something by doing it in a virtual or digital way. And there definitely are elements of that, whether that's just, the benefits around an event like this of being able to meet people around the edges and kind of have conversations, or for a service delivery organization actually realizing where they're delivering services to people and that element of human interaction and connection is vital. But then that can go the other way as well, in that a lot of organizations we've worked with through our emergency grant making at CAF have found that actually they thought they could never deliver services digitally because the people that they were working with were sort of very marginalized communities with complex needs. Actually, once they put the hardware in place and the systems, they were able to reach more people. And for the people they were reaching, they actually found they were able to have better interactions and conversations, which took them totally by surprise. So I think, that's brought to light for a lot of people some of the potential benefits of this, although I think we're all kind of aware of the challenges too.
Thank you. And Charles, coming back to your day job, in terms of investment and IT, what changes have you seen introduced to the system concerning obtaining clients' instructions and access to information?
Yeah, I mean, we, like a lot of industries, have seen a massive amount of change as far as technology is concerned, and a lot of it has been really beneficial. I'm afraid to say I'm old enough to remember where, charities or trustees used to have their investments, you know, on paper stocks in their own names, and every time you had a change of a trustee, you had to go and then apply for to re-register it into under new names. And you know, obviously from a security point of view, you had to keep it in a safe, but there were a whole lot of things. Now, of course, you know, it's all uncertificated. It's held in a custody, a nominee name on behalf of the charity, and you've got much greater protection. And also, you know, trustees have got much greater access to the information on a daily basis, where online access to the valuations, but also the way that they can look at reports and everything else. I think the one thing, again, picking up from James's point earlier around fraud and cybercrime, you know, as a trustee and chair of a finance committee, you know, the bit that I worry about is fraud and the ability for people to access our systems, and then I suppose to either remove information or even just as bad as you know, steal money. And to me, actually, a lot of it, and the Charity Commission, I have to say, got very good guidelines on it. Guidance on it, is around the protocols you put in place, but it's not just the protocols you put in place, is making sure that people are following them. And I think that if you've got good, strong protocols of things that can't happen without, you know, a certain number of signatures or authorization, whether that doesn't actually have to be a physical signature, it could be just a verbal one where somebody's got to ring for it or whatever, is actually you can stop an awful lot of people getting access to your systems. I mean, normally, if you ever talk to anybody who's an expert about sort of fraud and cybercrime, it's people who is the vulnerability within the system. And I was actually, funny enough, I was thinking the other day about you know, going back to Rhodri's comment. I think one of the key things is that where senior management and trustees, yes, do need to be very much so behind any form of technological change and supporting of system change, but actually we also need, I think, to be better at intergenerational communication, because we have an awful lot to learn. I just think about my children who are sort of, you know, 15, 16, 17, and the way that they use technology and the way they've grown up, and it just gets morphed into them. And I suppose a really good example of this was around contactless payments. And again, fantastic way, you know, trustee of Bowel Research UK, you know, where we'd have a fundraising dinner and people would hand over cash and everything else. And then we had this problem at 1 o'clock in the morning, is we'd be sitting on £20,000 worth of cash, and what would we do with it? And they're huge vulnerabilities. Well, now, of course, all you've got is you just need a card reader and somebody just to click it. But also you've got a whole generation that doesn't carry cash, doesn't understand why you would want to carry cash. And unless you're prepared to adapt, and you know, that to me was sort of, you know, being aware of something that's happening, keeping a watchful eye on it. When it first came out, phenomenally expensive to do it, the systems weren't great, and there were a whole lot of problems. You know, 2 or 3 years down the line, it suddenly becomes really cheap to do it. You can introduce it very easily, and suddenly you've actually I suppose increase the security around everything, then moves to a cashless society, so you can trace it. So I think there are, you know, technology has, we're seeing it in every walk of life, a massive change. I think you've just got to embrace it, and then just look at where it can be both beneficial, but also where the vulnerabilities are.
And James, what about the opportunities and the challenges of cryptocurrencies for charities? So, you know, we're hearing reports that charities are embracing crypto donations. Apparently they're more transparent and easier to deal with, but I wondered, is that the reality that you're seeing?
Yes, that's the next step on from Charles's contactless revolution, is the crypto revolution. It's a good question, and it's slightly difficult to answer this one, in as much as, you know, you think you're up to date on these sort of things, and then next week you're not. It's moving so quickly. Is it the reality that charities are embracing crypto? A few, I would have thought. A few, honestly, I would have thought a few bigger ones. I mean, it seems to me at the moment it's, there are clearly added benefits. It does reduce fees. It can access remote areas that lack, financial infrastructure. And it does open completely brand new opportunities for fundraising. A completely different set of people with a whole load of new money who might well have some very good philanthropic ideals. I think generally the charities that are benefiting from it at the moment are probably bigger international charities because of the benefits it brings and the fact that they've got the scope to really deal with this sort of thing. The recent recipients or the charities that have been exploiting crypto seem to be Red Cross or Save the Children, who are working in these remote areas, who have the scale and the scope to make use of the crypto donations. I mean, it is a curious one for charities, because one of the big pluses, souls to charities, if you like, or associated with cryptocurrency, is this whole idea of transparency. You can always see the full transparent track of money, see where it flows from and to, which is okay up to a point, but it unfortunately, it appears that actually you can't see who's really making these very big donations, and the transparency rather falls down if you can't actually identify the movements, who's behind the movement. You can only see the wallet, you can't see the person or the individual. So there are questions about identity for money laundering purposes. But the whole ethos behind, the whole feeling behind this, if it's being promoted as a transparent way of seeing financial transactions, you then see on the other side of that argument these Bitcoin whales, who are these very, very cyber currency whales, who have these large stocks of these cyber currencies, and you see these movements, which it seems are only really reported on Twitter and through the sort of tech media, these great big movements of cyber currency moving around the crypto world, moving around blockchain and whatever else. And I looked, there's been a couple recently, I had to write them down, but in October there was a massive Bitcoin movement, a whale movement, $112 million worth of Bitcoin moved. And that's as much as anyone knows. It just moved. It went from one place to another. And then in November, an Ethereum transfer movement of $117 million worth of Ethereum moved. But that's as much detail as there seems to be out there. So the whole nature of transparency, the whole argument about transparency, to me, rather falls down if you're not going to be able to verify who these big donors are if it gets to that point.
And Rhodri, I'm going to give you the final word, because I think you trump us all in terms of knowledge and experience on this. But in terms of a final prediction, what do you think charities should be keeping their eyes on in the coming, 5, 10, 15 years, if it can go that far?
I think there's a few things. I mean, just on the questions there about cryptocurrency. Yeah, it's something I've been working on for the last sort of 6 or 7 years, and I think James is right. I think I've seen enthusiasm go up as the value of Bitcoin and other crypto went up, particularly around sort of 2018, and then down again as it went very steeply down again. I think we're at an interesting point now because the value has gone back up, and that's happened at a point where, as I was saying before, I think because of what we're having to deal with during the pandemic, we're all thinking much more about digital tools. And also fundraisers are facing an incredibly difficult time when a lot of their traditional methods of fundraising have suddenly dried up. So actually they're looking around for new pools of money. So I think there might be renewed interest in cryptocurrency. I think on that point, there remain quite a lot of challenges for charities who want to get into it, which is why, as James said, there's a handful of very big organizations that have genuinely embraced it and are experimenting with it. There are quite a few small organizations that are tapping into it or just enabling donations through crypto in one way or another, often through intermediaries, and that's interesting to see. I think for most of them, as I say, what's key is that they do rely on intermediaries, people like the Giving Block and others who have grown quite big in the US. And what they generally do often is take crypto donations, but then turn them back into normal fiat money before passing it on to the charity. So essentially the charity can offer the functionality of people donating in cryptocurrency, but the charity themselves never holds on to any, which is good in terms of that volatility risk that there is. I think just one more thing on that is around the question of anonymity, because I think this is a real thing that we've seen an example of very recently in the last couple of weeks. There was an example where the Water Project, which is a US charity, and another conservation charity in the US received donations of about $10,000 each, I think, in Bitcoin via the Giving Block intermediary. But then it subsequently, a couple of days later, transpired that they were actually from the proceeds of an illegal hacking attack, because the hacker group came out and said they were sort of doing this on a Robin Hood basis. And this put the recipient charities in a really difficult position, because obviously they knew that they were the proceeds of crime, but they'd already received the funds. So what were they to do with it? And I think we might see more challenges like that in the future if, you can identify where the money's come from in terms of a Bitcoin address, but unless you can link that up with a person in the real world, these sorts of know your customer challenges are always going to be there. And again, I think that's where intermediaries are going to play a big role, because actually the model might be that you can give via an intermediary, but that intermediary has to do some more old-fashioned know your customer due diligence requirements before it will accept the Bitcoin donation, and then it will pass it on to the charity so that everything's fine. And that's how I suspect things might go over the next couple of years. I think looking a bit more broadly at that, and I won't go into this in too much detail, I think there are some really interesting things happening, some of which I think go around the kind of functional side of charities and some non-profits, and then some are probably of more interest in terms of the fundraising side of things. I think one area in which there are some really interesting movements is around the application of particularly kind of machine learning in regulatory environments and the whole sort of reg tech space. And we haven't really seen it in charities yet, but there are some really interesting examples in other areas in financial regulation of regulators starting to train machine learning algorithms on their data sets so that they can do what they call predictive regulation. So instead of sort of setting rules, waiting for people to break them and then imposing penalties, which is obviously the model we have now, you have a system in which you train an algorithm that's able to predict where risks are most likely to occur and go in and sort of intercept them before they happen. And so it shifts the entire model on its head. In some very interesting ways that can bring efficiencies, and also in some ways I think that might present some challenges. And then I think the two other areas which kind of pull in slightly different directions, one is a different use of AI, which is around the sort of shift away from visual interfaces. So we're very used to using screen-based technology, but increasingly we're seeing computing technology and access to the internet embedded in non-visual interfaces like conversational assistants like Alexa and Siri and Google. And I think increasingly we'll see that spread out even more into what they call edge computing, which is when there's sort of computing power embedded in all the objects around us, and you have this sort of ambient internet. And I think then the questions about how fundraising works and how we make choices and how we're presented with information are really interesting. I think questions about data and how it's captured and who owns it and how we ensure its security also become, really much more amplified. And then on the other side of the equation, I think there's a whole basket of really interesting technologies around the more sort of emotional and experiential side of things. So I think we're just about getting to the point where virtual and augmented reality are overcoming the hurdles of people finding them a bit clunky. And the next few years, I think we'll see them really take off. And we're already seeing there's loads of examples of charities experimenting with using those for awareness raising and fundraising. People like Charity Water, but also Oxfam have done some really interesting stuff, creating sort of 360 videos and then going out and giving fundraising teams very low cost Google Cardboard headsets and on the street giving people a sort of experience. And actually as a new form of immersive storytelling that can really drive supporter empathy, I think these could be an incredibly powerful tool for charity fundraising in the future. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that develops.
Thank you. Really interesting stuff there on the horizon. So that just leaves to me to thank our three panelists today, Charles, James and Rhodri. I think we've had some really interesting comments and exploration of different angles. We very much hope that you've enjoyed the webinar, and if you do have any comments or feedback or suggestions, we'd be very interested to hear from you, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thanks very much.